Hey folks, today I'm going to be doing an end of summer book wrap up. Because I didn't get much of a chance to talk to you guys about the books that I was reading toward the end of July, August, and September, I thought this would be a good opportunity to sit down and share with you guys some of the things that I was reading. So without further ado, on with the books. First, I have Miss Ex-Yugoslavia by Sofija Stefanovic. This is a memoir slash coming of age story about the author and her relocation to either Australia or New Zealand. I can't quite remember where they expatriated, but growing up in what is now the former Yugoslavia and moving after the conflict hit in the 90s, and sort of how the effects of not just relocating and expatriating, but also how does one stay connected with a culture that can no longer be identified by name? There are things about this book that I really very much enjoyed. There were moments of tenderness and moments of hilarity, but there were also these moments that were sort of captivating in a way because you don't necessarily see these things present when people are talking about war or conflict situations. So for instance, there was one section of the book where she discussed a classmate of hers just not showing up to school one day. And the reason for this being was that his father was apprehended by the opposition, most likely killed. And especially as a child, not being able to necessarily identify the cause of that problem, but just knowing that something's amiss, something's not right, that something has created a rupture in your social world. I really enjoyed hearing about her high school and college experiences too, and how just they were very normal considering the things that she grew up with. But I think also in the setting of that, trying to share history with people not really knowing where that history is, especially when you can't point to something on a map and say, this is where I'm from, this is where I come from. Overall, this is not a book that I would suggest to people to run out and get. However, I think if you were to encounter it in a library setting or a discounted book setting, that it would be worth picking up. The second book I have to tell you about is Red Clocks by Leni Zumas. This was making the rounds on BookTube last year, and people had extraordinary things to say about it. It made a few people's top 10, top 5 books of the year last year and part of this year. This book follows 5 characters, and the setting has been described as a dystopia. Roe v. Wade has been overturned, and favor has been given to fetuses who are deemed decision-making. So this legislation has changed the conversation around reproductive rights and a woman's right to choose. And as such, we have 5 separate women who are sort of on different sides of being affected by this legislation. So there's a woman who is already a mother of 2, and she's sort of grappling with the idea of what it is to be a wife and a mother. We have a storyteller, so a woman who is sort of record keeping and writing a history of a character that we never meet. We have a woman who is considered a witch because she is a practitioner of alternative medicine, and I've heard her described as sort of a midwife. And then there's also a woman who is trying to get pregnant, and then there is a teenage girl who is pregnant and is seeking termination of that pregnancy. So one of the things I really enjoyed about this book was the, I think, realistic conversations that would happen were this piece of legislation to actually come to pass, and the consequences and the penalties that would go along with that. What I think was also kind of interesting to think about was how the paradigm shift would happen so quickly, where people would absolutely be on board with penalizing women for seeking reproductive drugs, or not being able to raise a child on your own as a single mother, even though you're perfectly capable and have the means to do so. So I think in terms of a piece of speculative work, it does work, and it was interesting to think about these things. However, I don't think that people who have pontificated on the potential overturning of Roe v. Wade have not thought about these things. And so, again, nothing groundbreaking, and I don't think that for me it's going to be making one of my top 5 books, but I do think it was a good thought experiment. The next book I have to share with you guys is Peach by Emma Glass. This was a debut novel that was released earlier this year and is written in a polished stream of consciousness style. This book follows a college-aged girl who, when the book opens and we meet her, she has just been raped. And we proceed to follow her through the following days after this attack as she's trying to wade through the emotional and physical aftermath of the attack. This character oscillates between having some feigned normal days and then having some very, very distressing days. There's this constant source of tension and constant source of fear that is following her through these days after her attack. And much of that has to do with the fact that her attacker is somebody who she knows or somehow has frequent contact with. And so the threat of him being there, and sometimes she sees him and it's unclear whether or not this is real, this is psychosomatic, or if him sort of lingering around is possibly supposed to be a metaphor on the attack. It's sort of unclear. However, there's no doubt that Emma Glass writes this with a lot of tension and a lot of imagery that is just very disturbing. Emma Glass, I think, has this gift for creating a lot of sense memory, which I think is something kind of special about her writing, is that she's able to write so vividly about these things that just really hit your senses. She creates this sort of disorienting world where things just feel sort of drippy and very caustic. That said, I think this was a little bit of a tricky book to get behind because the writing style was so odd. Now, I'm not one to turn my nose up at experimental styles or experimental fiction. I also think that when people tend to write in a minimalist style, they have to be very careful about treading the line between being minimal and being abstract, because sometimes the story gets buried in the desire to make things so experimental. And I think maybe that's what happened a little bit here. So I'd love to revisit Emma Glass's work when she does get a little bit more confident in her writing style. I think that already some of the ideas and some of the things, her capabilities that she's demonstrated in this work are very, very good. And I think that she will be an author to watch out for. However, I don't think that her capabilities were exactly met in this particular work. The next book was a book club selection, and that was Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. This was my first foray into both of these authors' works, and it really just left me wanting more. This book is set up very much like a joke. An angel and a demon walk into a bar, and these two are just perfectly matched. They have been charged with overseeing the upcoming rapture, but their fatal flaw is that they have become a little too attached to humans. I listened to this on audiobook, and it was narrated by Martin Jarvis, who was nothing short of perfection. And if you guys are interested in listening to the audiobook, he is a spectacular person to have narrate this. This book was simultaneously insightful and hilarious, and poked fun at the most ridiculous facets of humanity. It also takes our most fabled and propped up religious figures and archetypes and takes them down a few notches to be able to expose the fallibility of them. Angels and demons express dissatisfaction with their jobs and their role in life. One of my favorite parts about this was the convent hospital that was staffed by nuns who were devout Satanists. Something I think that was exceptional about what these two authors achieved here was that they were able to take the subject matter with which they were writing about and treat it with a lot of respect. Also, to see the nuances in it and not take it so seriously. They were really careful about what they chose to poke fun at and what they chose to preserve. And I think that that is a mark of two very smart authors. In a conversation I was having with a friend about this book, I was curious about the flawlessness of the chapters. I couldn't really tell any stylistic variations between Neil Gaiman's writing and Terry Pratchett's writing. So when I asked him about it, he had seen an interview where the two of them could not remember who wrote what chapters. And I think that that's something that speaks very highly of them being able to co-author a book, is that they understood each other's humor, they understood each other's writing, and it just made for a beautifully cohesive work. Because of this, I'm interested in reading the authors separately. So said friend lent me a few Terry Pratchett books that I'm excited to get to. Hopefully I can get to them by November or December. Next is My Soul to Keep by Tananarive. This book was originally supposed to be a standalone, but the author said as she was thinking more about the characters, there was just more of a story to be told. So this ended up being book one in a series called the African Immortals series. And this book follows Jessica and David, who are a married couple. They live in Florida. Jessica is a journalist and David is a college professor. And he's sort of described as Mr. Perfect. So he not only is a professor, but he's an extremely talented musician. He is a polyglot. He's extraordinarily handsome, among other attributes, but a series of events begins to create a lot of tension in Jessica and David's marriage. And most of those events had to do with the fact that David is part of a secret brethren of Immortals that is based out of Ethiopia. When I first started listening to this book, I was a little apprehensive. Part of it was reading as a paranormal romance, part of it was reading as a mystery thriller, and so I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, but it wasn't enough to deter me from continuing on with the book, and I'm really, really glad that I did. As I went on, this book raised a lot of questions for me about the burden of immortality and the burden of longevity. One of the aspects that I thought was really compelling was that David, being a young man and living as long as he had just suffered so many deaths, and that each of these deaths is not peaceful, and it is not succumbing to illness, that usually within this age range, when you're going to die a somewhat violent death. And that every time David came up against this sort of situation, that it was always terrifying and it was always scary, and that it really prompted me to think about how the fear of death is not ameliorated by the promise of resurrection. The storytelling was incredibly tight. The mythology knew exactly what it was. And something that I really enjoy about Tananarive's writing is that it's quite simple. There are not a whole lot of linguistic gymnastics that she has to employ to be able to pull off a good story. As I was trying to come up with some sort of visual comparison that I could make, the thing that popped into my head was the art of Andy Goldsworthy or of Patrick Dougherty, where the medium with which they use is very simple. There's nothing fancy, there's nothing gimmicky about the material that's being used. However, what is able to be made out of that material is something monumental and very impressive. And to me, that's what I felt with Tananarive's writing, is that though it was very simple, it's not flowery, it's not lyrical, what she's able to construct is something impressive and quality. Stephen King compared her writing to Anne Rice, and while I think that there are some similarities. I think something that Anne Rice tends to do is make her writing so full of description, so much that it feels edematous. Whereas I think Tananarive tends to show some restraint and is very selective about the rabbit holes that she takes you down with her descriptions. It's getting so good, you guys. It's getting so good. So if you're interested, definitely check out Tananarive's books. She also has another book called The In-Between, which I believe was her first. So give it a go. A couple of other books that I ended up reading over those months were Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. Gillian Flynn? Is it a hard G? Gillian? Gillian Flynn. This was a buddy read with Dane Reeds and a bunch of other people that he invited to read some books with this summer. And I do have to say, I don't know that I can say that I'm glad I read a Gillian Flynn book. I feel like I could have gone the rest of my life without knowing her work and be perfectly fine. I think that there was just nothing that compelling about the book to me. And in fact, I think that there are authors who sort of toy with the same elements as she does, but do it in a much more sophisticated way. And one of those books is Ill Will by Dan Choan, I think is how you say his name. I'll put it in the description box and put it here. But he very much toys with the same sorts of ideas and elements that are present in Dark Places, but again, I think just does them with a little bit more sophistication and a little bit more class, and definitely with a lot more interest. And lastly, I have The Stranger by Albert Camus. This was a buddy reread I did with Celia, and I'll link her channel below. She's lovely, definitely go check her out. I think the both of us had a very different reception of this book the second time around. This is a well-loved classic that follows a young man we know as Marcel. And when we meet him, his mother is on her deathbed and he's charged with taking care of her affairs. After her death, life seems to be getting somewhat better for him until he murders an Arab man on a beach while he's on sort of a mini holiday with some friends. And he does this out of protection for one of his friends. He's placed on trial for the murder of this man, and that's basically the macro look at this book. One of the observations I made the second time around was how cinematic this book was. There were descriptions of the sun and the way it was glaring and sort of burning that gave this very febrile effect to the beach scenes in particular. So much so that you didn't know whether the experience was a misperception or if it was something within a dream. Also, there was this scene in the nursing home when Marcel's mother is dead and her friends are sort of holding vigil around her bed, and it's late and the light in there is kind of muddy and sort of murky, and you can't really tell if it's dusk or if it's dawn. And that sort of lighting just indicates this thinning of the celestial veil, right? Like it's so eerie, but everyone's sort of falling asleep around the bed, and Marcel falls asleep, and when he wakes up, this old man is just staring at him, and he has this solid stare, but it is so laden with judgment and suspect that it makes Marcel very uncomfortable. And just waking up like that and having this very aged face, this aged gaze just unravel you without your permission, it was so powerful, just such a powerful scene. And Celia made this observation that Marcel's relationship to the environment just far exceeded his relationship to humans. And I guess I didn't really catch it before, but it's very true, and he was able to describe everything in his environment. He was able to express these very vulnerable thoughts about the natural world, but was not necessarily able to exercise that vulnerability with humans and with people around him. And my thought with regard to that is that Marcel probably felt that the natural world was a much more consistent and reliable companion. Nature, unlike people, shows you exactly what it is and not what you want it to be. Nature contains duality, but not duplicity. And duplicity is what he encounters while on trial for murder. Now he, in addition to being put on trial for murder, is just being put on trial for his social distortion, for not being the right kind of man, for not possessing the right set of emotions or the right reactions to things. This is really evident when a priest comes to visit him and he refuses to see the priest. He doesn't want to pray. He doesn't want absolution for a crime. He doesn't want to be absolved of sins because he doesn't see it necessarily as a sin, that he was protecting a friend. It's been suggested that this book be reread again and again, and I couldn't agree more. I feel like on first reading, you get the lay of the land. You start to pick up the macro concepts that are present in it. However, with subsequent readings, my hope is to just penetrate these layers deeper and deeper, eventually hitting some collagen and hitting some bone. And I'm hoping also that with the supplementation of other authors in this school, that it'll help to deepen my understanding of this text, because I do feel that it is something special and there's a reason it's such a well-loved classic. But that's all I have for you guys this time. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know, as always, if you've read any of these books, if you love any of these books, if you hate any of these books, or if you have any suggestions for authors like Camus. I hope you guys have a really wonderful day, and I will see you very soon. Take care. Bye.